2:33 a.m. Gulf Standard Time. The Persian Gulf is not designed for submarine warfare. Its average depth is 35 meters, shallower than a standard torpedo's maximum operating depth in several sectors, shallower than the minimum safe diving depth for a conventional submarine during emergency maneuvers across large portions of its northern basin. The thermal layering that makes deep ocean ASW possible, the cold, dense water below the thermocline that traps sound and creates the acoustic shadow zones a submarine uses to hide, barely exists in the Gulf. The water column from surface to bottom is almost uniformly warm, uniformly saline, and almost uniformly transparent to active sonar. A submarine in the Persian Gulf is operating in an environment that actively works against it. The IRGCN had spent 16 years learning to use that environment anyway. The 3 Kilo-class submarines of the Islamic Republic of Iran Navy had been acquired from Russia in the 1990s and had been operating in the Persian Gulf and Gulf of Oman since 1995. They were Project 877 EKM boats, the export variant of the Soviet-era design, diesel-electric, capable of significant quieting when running on battery power, limited in the Gulf by the thermal environment, but more capable than any analysis built on Mediterranean or Atlantic ASW assumptions would suggest. The IRGCN had run these boats against Iranian shallow water conditions for 27 years. Their crews understood the Gulf's specific acoustic environment with a granularity that no foreign navy had been able to replicate without operating in it continuously. They knew where the thermal layers were deepest at which tidal phase. They knew which channel bottoms created backscatter that confused active sonar returns. They knew which coastal geometry provided acoustic shadow from the shipping traffic that never stopped moving through the Strait of Hormuz, regardless of geopolitical conditions. At 2:33 a.m., 3 Kilo-class submarines that had been pre-positioned over a period of 19 days, entering the Gulf at intervals spaced to avoid correlation, navigating to pre-assigned holding positions using passive sonar and inertial navigation, maintaining strict emissions control throughout, activated their weapons management systems simultaneously. They were not in the Gulf at 2:33 a.m. 2 were. 1 was in the Gulf of Oman, positioned in the deep water east of the strait, the only sector where a Kilo could operate at a depth that gave it genuine acoustic advantage. That boat, designated Contact 3 by the P-8 Poseidon Maritime Patrol aircraft that had been working the strait approaches since midnight, had been assessed as the highest threat to the carrier group operating 190 nautical miles northwest of the strait in the central Gulf. It was outside the Gulf. Its weapons could reach inside it. The Kilo's primary anti-ship weapon in this deployment was the 3 M54 Kalibr cruise missile, the submarine-launched variant that the IRGCN had confirmed operational in 2022 and that had fundamentally changed the threat calculus for every U.S. naval commander operating in the region since. The 3 M54's subsonic transit phase and supersonic terminal sprint at Mach 2.9 made it a categorically different threat from the Kilo's older torpedo armament. It could be launched from periscope depth without a precise fire control solution. Approximate targeting data was sufficient for the missile's own seeker to acquire a large surface target in the final phase. And it could be launched from outside the Gulf, through the strait, to targets inside it. Contact 3 carried 8 3M54 rounds. At 2:33 a.m., the launch sequence initialized. Contact 1 and Contact 2 were inside the Gulf. Contact 1 had been holding at 28 meters depth in a channel between the Tunbi Islands and the Iranian coast, a position whose acoustic clutter from the island's reflection geometry had partially masked its presence from the AN/SS Q125 sonobuoys that the P-8 had been placing in patterns across the central Gulf approaches since 11 p.m. Contact 2 was in the southwestern Gulf, in the shallow water south of the Farsi Island complex, a position so acoustically hostile, bottom reverberation, shipping noise from the tanker lanes, thermal noise from the warm surface layer, that the P-8's acoustic processing had classified it as probable biological contact 3 times in 4 hours before a tonal analysis at 2:14 a.m. had produced a classification confidence of 71%. 71% was below the standard threshold for engagement authorization. It was above the threshold for continued tracking and increased alert. The simultaneous weapon system activation at 2:33 a.m. was not something the P-8's acoustic sensors detected directly. What they detected was a change in Contact 1's acoustic signature consistent with a pump activation, the hydraulic system that pressurized the torpedo tube outer door before a launch sequence. The P-8's acoustic sensor operator, tracking Contact 1 on passive sonobuoy returns, had been watching that contact for 90 minutes. The pump signature was distinctive and unambiguous. She transmitted the classification update at 2:34 a.m. Contact 1 active weapon sequence detected. Launch imminent. The carrier group's commanding officer had been at battle station since 2:14 a.m. when Contact 2's 71% classification had arrived. The carrier group's surface combatants were in their assigned ASW screening geometry. 2 destroyers ahead on the northern and southern approach axes, the cruiser on the eastern bearing toward the strait, all 3 with their hull-mounted sonars in active mode. Active sonar in the Gulf's shallow, reverberant environment was a blunt instrument. It detected large, hard targets at ranges compressed to 4 to 6 nautical miles rather than the 15 to 20 nautical mile active detection ranges achievable in deeper, colder water. But at 4 to 6 nautical miles, a Kilo-class submarine attempting to reposition for an optimal weapon solution would be detectable. The geometry kept the Kilos in their holding positions rather than maneuvering toward better attack bearings. That was the constraint the IRGCN's operational planning had addressed. The Kilos did not need optimal attack bearings. Contact 1 in the Tunby Islands channel had a bearing on the carrier group that was 34 degrees off optimal for a torpedo attack but within the 3 M54's off-axis launch parameters. Contact 2 in the Farsi Island shallows had an angular geometry that made a torpedo solution against the carrier nearly impossible, but a missile launch feasible against the 2 destroyers on the carrier's screening axes. Contact 3 in the Gulf of Oman had a clean bearing into the strait on a trajectory that placed the carrier at the end of the 3 M54's 660-kilometer maximum range, long for the standard engagement but within the weapon's certified envelope against a large surface target. The IRGCN had positioned 3 submarines in 3 separate sectors of an enclosed sea, each one in the worst possible position for torpedo attack, each one in an adequate position for missile attack. The ASW assets protecting the carrier group had been designed to prevent torpedo attacks by keeping submarines at standoff range. The 3 M54 meant standoff range was irrelevant. The P-8 crew transmitted their Contact 1 weapon sequence detection at 2:34 a.m. The carrier group commander received it simultaneously with a contact update from the southern destroyer. Contact 2 had moved. The 71% classification contact had been stationary for 4 hours. In the previous 6 minutes, it had changed depth and was now producing a maneuvering signature consistent with the submarine transitioning from a holding posture to a launch depth approach. 2 contacts in active weapon sequence. A third contact in the Gulf of Oman, whose status was unknown because the P-8 had repositioned from the strait approaches to cover the Gulf contacts 40 minutes earlier. The carrier group commander transmitted the ASW engagement request to CENTCOM at 2:35 a.m. CENTCOM's response, engagement authorization for defensive action against confirmed hostile submarines, arrived at 2:36 a.m. 61 seconds. The Virginia-class attack submarine that had been running silent 18 nautical miles south of Contact 1's position since 1:45 a.m. had been provided Contact 1's location, depth, and course by the P-8's sonobuoy feed through a secure acoustic communications link that the IRGCN's passive sonar could not detect. The Virginia had been tracking Contact 1 on its own passive array for 37 minutes. Its fire control solution had been at high confidence since 2:09 a.m. It had been waiting for authorization. At 2:36 a.m., the authorization arrived. The Virginia released an Mk-48 aid cap heavyweight torpedo at Contact 1 at 2:36 a.m. At a range of 18 nautical miles, the Mk-48's transit time to acquisition range was approximately 16 minutes. The P-8 simultaneously dropped a pattern of 6 Mk-54 lightweight torpedoes across Contact 2's last confirmed position at 2:36 a.m., an area engagement against a contact whose precise location was known within a 400-meter radius but not precisely. 6 Mk-54s in a pattern covering a 400-meter radius had a combined engagement probability significantly higher than any single weapon against the same contact. Contact 3 in the Gulf of Oman had not been engaged. There were no ASW assets in its sector. The Virginia was in the Central Gulf. The second P-8, which had been at Farsi Island Air Base on rotational standby, was airborne at 2:38 a.m. But its transit time to the strait approaches from Farsi was 42 minutes. 42 minutes was longer than the 3 M-54's flight time from the Gulf of Oman to the carrier group's current position. At 2:39 a.m., Contact 3 launched. 8 3M-54. Kalibr cruise missiles cleared the water off the southern coast of the Strait of Hormuz, went feet wet immediately, and settled into their low-altitude transit profiles heading northwest through the strait toward the Central Gulf. The Strait of Hormuz is 33 nautical miles wide at its narrowest point. A missile flying at 15 meters altitude through the strait was below the radar horizon of every shore-based radar installation on the Omani coast and barely detectable from the Iranian side due to the sea clutter return at that altitude. The transit through the strait took approximately 9 minutes at cruise speed. 9 minutes during which the missiles were navigating through one of the busiest maritime passages on the planet, weaving through the radar returns of commercial tanker traffic that moved through those lanes regardless of the military activity occurring around them. The tanker traffic did not stop. It did not know to stop. The NOTAM that would close the strait would not be issued for another 40 minutes. The EA-18G Growler on standby at Al Udeid, which had been airborne since 2:14 a.m. following the Contact 2 classification update, was already over the strait approaches when the 3 M-54 launch signatures appeared on the P-8's surface radar. The Growler activated its jamming package against the 3 M-54's navigation and data link frequencies at 2:41 a.m. The jamming degraded the missile's mid-course update capability. They continued navigating on preloaded inertial guidance. The carrier group's Aegis radar network acquired the 3 M-54S at 2:43 a.m. as they crossed the strait and entered the Gulf airspace, flying at 15 meters altitude on inbound bearings toward the formation. 8 tracks at 660 kilometers per hour in transit phase. SM-2 and SM-6 interceptors from the cruiser and the northern destroyer began engaging the outer formation at 2:46 a.m. 5 of the 8 were neutralized in the outer and mid-range engagement zones. 3 reached the terminal sprint phase, accelerating to Mach 2.9 for the final 15 kilometers of their approach. The terminal sprint at Mach 2.9 gave the CIWS engagement system 1.8 seconds from acquisition to intercept opportunity. All 3 Terminal Phase 3 M-54 seconds were engaged by CIWS on the carrier and the southern destroyer simultaneously. 2 were neutralized. The third, its terminal seeker executing a jinking maneuver in the final 600 meters, was engaged by CIWS at 380 meters. The burst connected with the missile body but not the seeker head, which separated and continued on inertial trajectory, impacting the carrier's flight deck at the starboard aft elevator area. The 40-kilogram shaped charge in the seeker head detonated on impact. Significant damage to the elevator housing and the deck plating in a 12-meter radius. 12 flight deck crew were in the area during the engagement. 4 received moderate injuries from the blast. 8 received minor injuries. 1 elevator was rendered non-operational. Flight operations were suspended for 11 minutes while damage assessment was completed. The carrier resumed air operations at 2:57 a.m. The 11-minute suspension had been the operationally most significant single effect of the entire engagement. Not the physical damage, which was repairable, but the constraint on flight deck operations at the moment when the carrier air wing needed to be cycling its combat air patrol. The gap had been covered by the F-35Cs that had been on cap at altitude when the engagement began and had sufficient fuel to maintain station throughout the 11-minute deck suspension. The coverage had held. The gap had been real. Post-engagement analysis would examine whether the IRGCN's targeting of the starboard aft elevator, rather than a more structurally damaging aim point, had been designed specifically to create an operational disruption rather than physical destruction. The assessment was probable. A Kalibr seeker head at the elevator was more likely to disrupt flight operations than to structurally disable the carrier. The IRGCN had studied U.S. carrier operations for 30 years. They knew which components disrupted operations without triggering an existential response. 1 hit on the carrier. 1 elevator non-operational. 4 moderate and 8 minor injuries. Flight operations suspended 11 minutes. Contact 2 had launched at 2:36 a.m., simultaneously with the Virginia's engagement of Contact 1. 3:03 - 54 seconds, and 2 torpedoes directed at the southern destroyer. The P-8's Mk-54 pattern reached Contact 2's position at 2:39 a.m. 2 of the 6 Mk-54s achieved acquisition of the contact. 1 detonated. Contact 2 went silent at 2:39 a.m. The 2 torpedoes Contact 2 had released at 2:36 a.m. were wire-guided to a range of approximately 4 nautical miles before the wire severed when Contact 2 ceased active operation. Without wire guidance, both torpedoes transitioned to autonomous acoustic homing. The southern destroyer's hull-mounted sonar detected both torpedo tracks at 2:40 a.m. The destroyer accelerated to maximum speed and executed a hard turn to put the torpedoes on a stern chase bearing, a classic counter-torpedo maneuver that extended the range the torpedoes had to cover and gave the decoy launchers their best geometry. 4 Mk-53. Nixie towed acoustic decoys deployed at 2:40 a.m. 1 torpedo acquired the Nixie decoy at 2:41 a.m. and followed it to detonation at 2:41 a.m. in open water 800 meters astern of the destroyer. The second torpedo maintained course on the destroyer, resisting the Nixie, approaching at 45 knots. At 2:42 a.m., at a range of 600 meters, the torpedo's proximity fuse triggered on the destroyer's stern wake, the thermal and acoustic signature of the destroyer's own propulsion system at maximum output. The torpedo detonated in the destroyer's wake, 140 meters astern. The blast pressure from an underwater detonation at 140 meters caused significant hull stress in the aft engineering spaces. The shaft seals showed elevated leakage. 1 gas turbine was taken offline for inspection. The ship maintained propulsion and combat capability but was assessed as requiring a return to port for hull inspection before its next operational cycle. 1 destroyer with hull stress from near-miss underwater detonation. Combat capable, port inspection required. Contact 1, the Kilo in the Tunby Islands Channel, had launched 3 M54s at 2:36 a.m. simultaneously with its torpedo doors cycling. The 3 Kalibrs from Contact 1 added to the inbound threat, as the Aegis network was simultaneously managing Contact 3's 8-weapon salvo. The Aegis engagement architecture had been preloaded with both salvo's approach parameters from the moment Contact 1's launch was detected. The EC network distributed the engagement assignments across the formation in real time. 2 of Contact 1's 3 Kalibrs were intercepted in the outer zone. The third was intercepted by CICUS at 1.1 kilometers from the cruiser. Contact 1 ceased acoustic activity at 2:52 a.m., 16 minutes after the Virginia released its Mk-48. The Mk-48 had transited at 55 knots, acquired Contact 1's acoustic signature at 2:48 a.m. as the Kilo attempted an emergency ascent toward minimum torpedo arming depth and had closed to detonation range at 2:52 a.m. The acoustic signature of the detonation was logged by 3 separate sonobuoys in the area. Contact 1 was assessed as non-operational. Contact 2, non-operational at 2:39 a.m. Contact 3, it had fired its full 8-missile load from the Gulf of Oman and was withdrawing south at maximum speed on battery. The Virginia received updated position data on Contact 3 from the second P-8, which had reached the strait approaches at 3:20 a.m. The Virginia had repositioned from the Tunby Islands engagement area and was now 31 nautical miles southeast of Contact 3's assessed position. A second Mk-48 was released at 3:24 a.m. Contact 3's crew detected the torpedo on passive sonar at 3:29 a.m. and immediately surfaced. The shallow water of the strait approaches did not give them enough depth for effective evasion at depth, and the surface was the only position from which they could transmit. They broadcast a distress signal on the International Maritime Frequency at 3:30 a.m. The Mk-48 acquired the now surfaced contact at 3:31 a.m. The Virginia's commanding officer had the wire. He held the weapon at 3:31 a.m., waiting for CENTCOM confirmation that the surface status was assessed as a genuine cessation of hostilities rather than a tactical maneuver. CENTCOM's response at 3:33 a.m. confirmed the assessment as probable cessation. The weapon was commanded to safe at 3:33 a.m. Contact 3 remained surfaced. The IRGCN crew had survived. By 3:35 a.m., 62 minutes after the simultaneous weapons activation, the engagement was complete. Time from simultaneous weapons activation to end of active engagement, 62 minutes. By RGCN weapons employed. Contact 1, 3, Kalibr 3M54 cruise missiles, 2 torpedoes, wire-guided. Contact 2, 3 Kalibr 3M54 cruise missiles, 2 torpedoes. Contact 3, 8 Kalibr 3M54 cruise missiles. Total, 9 cruise missiles from Gulf internal kilos, 8 cruise missiles from Gulf of Oman kilo. 4 torpedoes. Cruise missile intercept rates. 3 M54 from Contact 1 and 2. 100%, 5 of 5 CIWS at 1.1 kilometers from cruiser. 3 M-54 from Contact 3, 87.5%. 7 of 8 seeker fragment hit on carrier deck. Combined cruise missile intercept rate, 92.3%. Torpedo engagements. Contact 2 torpedoes. 1 defeated by Nixie decoy. 1 proximity detonation at 140 meters. Underwater pressure event on destroyer. Contact 1 torpedoes. Both lost guidance when Contact ceased operations before reaching detonation range. Effects: carrier flight deck elevator housing damage, 11-minute flight ops suspension, 4 moderate and 8 minor personnel injuries, destroyer aft hull stress from proximity detonation, combat capable, port inspection required, cruiser and second destroyer undamaged. ASW results: Contact 1 non-operational at 2:52 a.m. Mk-48. Contact 2 non-operational at 2:39 a.m. Mk-54 pattern. Contact 3 surfaced and ceased operations at 3:30 a.m. Weapon held on CENTCOM assessment. The IRGCN had spent 16 years learning to operate the world's most acoustically challenging body of water in platforms designed for deeper, colder seas. They had achieved one confirmed effect on a U.S. carrier: a seeker head fragment, 40 kilograms, detonating on a flight deck elevator housing. They had produced a hull stress event on a destroyer that would require weeks of inspection and repair. 2 of their 3 submarines were assessed as non-operational. The third had surfaced and its crew had survived. Against any conventional military analysis, the Gulf's hostile ASW environment had not saved the Kilos. The Virginia's passive tracking advantage, the P-8's sonobuoy density, and the prepositioned engagement geometry had overcome the shallow water, the thermal noise, and the 27 years of IRGCN experience in the most difficult operating environment their submarines had ever used. The carrier flight deck crew had the elevator housing under assessment at 3:40 a.m. The engineers estimated 48 hours for temporary repair, sufficient to restore partial elevator capacity. Full repair would require a shipyard visit after the deployment cycle. The carrier's commanding officer read the assessment and approved the repair timeline. Then she asked about the personnel status. 12 injuries. 4 moderate, 8 minor. All 12 were accounted for and in treatment. None assessed as life-threatening. She logged the status and returned to the bridge. Flight operations had resumed at 2:57 a.m. The carrier was still in the Central Gulf. The watch continued.